experience, which is just a small portion of the diversity of experiences out there. And so I'd encourage you to keep asking and getting to know other people with vision impairments to hear from them what they would suggest about how to engage better. A vision impairment is vision loss that can't be fully corrected by glasses, contacts, surgery, or medication. There are about 250 million people in the world with vision impairments. The majority of these don't have profound or total blindness. Most have some usable vision. For most people, vision impairment means that the world around them is just very blurry, or that there's only a small field of vision or portion of the world that they can view at a time. Vision loss does tend to be a consequence of aging, so it increases in prevalence as people age. And in my experience, I've noticed quite a few differences in kind of the attitude or perception of people who have had vision impairment from a young age and people who acquire vision loss as they age. Most people who've had vision impairments since a young age or from birth really prize their independence and are very capable of independent mobility and getting around in the world. And so this really makes it all the more important for people to ask before helping someone with a vision impairment. It can be really disorienting if someone comes up to me and starts to try to guide me somewhere or pulls on my white cane to try to take me somewhere without explaining, since people with vision impairments often can't catch nonverbal cues. So there are a couple of really simple but really important things that you can do when you're engaging with someone with a vision impairment or blindness. The first is to always identify yourself by name. Usually people with vision impairments recognize people by their voices or perhaps the way they walk or their general shape. But it can be very exhausting and nerve-wracking to always be trying to guess who's talking to you, who's saying hello. So you can always, when you come up to someone with a vision impairment, just say, "Hey, it's Amberly. It's good to see you." We, of course, also in the same vein, would suggest to identify the person that you're speaking to by name, because again, the nonverbal of looking at someone or holding your hand out to someone might be missed. So if you're asking a question to me, it's always best if you ask, "How are you, Amberly?" so that I know that you're talking to me rather than to the person next to me. There are a lot of awkward social situations that I think I've experienced as I've gotten used to living with a vision impairment, and these two things can really alleviate some of those anxieties. The next thing I want to talk about is some of the practicalities of sharing the gospel with someone with a vision impairment. So this is probably one of the disabilities that actually requires less adaptation, because most of us are pretty used to sharing the gospel verbally through stories or testimonies or scripture that we're sharing. Just remember that when you're talking to someone with a vision impairment, any nonverbals or visuals that you use need to be described. And also remember that people with vision impairments are generally print blind, so they can't read if you give them a Bible to read or a typical handout. Some may be able to read large print text, but that can also be a challenge. So always explain and read out loud what you're trying to communicate. When we talk about discipleship, many of us equate reading the Bible to discipleship. And so this is one area where we do need to make adaptations and think bigger about what discipleship is. For me personally, I tend to read my Bible by listening to it, which is very convenient using an iPhone with VoiceOver or the YouVersion app. But perhaps in places where there's less access to technology, this can be a challenge. There are audio Bibles out there and audio CDs that have Bible recordings on them that can be very useful. But this would be one place where we need to think creatively about how to encourage someone to grow in their knowledge of Scripture. There's of course also Braille resources that are available and often at a very affordable or low price or for free. However, only about 10% of people with vision impairments actually read Braille, so this may only be something that's useful for a small portion of people who are blind. Aside from communication barriers, the other major barrier that people with vision impairments may face is transportation barriers. So, for example, if you're meeting for a Bible study or just meeting to talk or going to church, getting to that location can be quite a challenge. It can be good to ask that person their preference on where to meet, because oftentimes people know where they're able to get independently and are able to navigate familiar spaces more readily. Only about 2 to 8% of people with vision impairment use a white cane to navigate. So that means most of them are using a sighted guide, their usable vision, or perhaps the guide dog. This makes it all the more important that we use universal design when we're talking to and engaging with people, because it's very likely that you might actually not know if somebody has a vision impairment unless they disclose it to you. If someone is using a guide dog or a white cane, never touch that white cane or dog to try to steer them in their direction, because that can also be very disorienting. Perhaps the most important barrier we need to think about with vision impairment, as with many other disabilities, is our attitudes. People with vision impairments often are seen as incapable, perhaps incapable of hearing or speaking or serving or learning. And so we really need to examine those biases that we have and recognize that many people with vision impairments are extremely capable, intelligent, and gifted. And that when we leave those people out of the church, we're actually missing out on the gifts that God's given them to contribute. In fact, there are many examples of God using people who are blind in Scripture to disciple others, whether through healings, showing His glory, but also people who had vision impairments chronically. Many scholars think that Paul had a chronic vision impairment, and that was the thorn in his side. There's also an early church father named Didymus the Blind, who was one of the very first theologians to work out some of the complex and important theological concepts as the early church was being formed. So always, as with other disabilities, look for and remember that there are important gifts that people with vision impairments have and ways that they can serve and lead.